This video is sponsored by TrueFire. Over 2 million guitar players worldwide improve their guitar playing using TrueFire's online lesson systems. Learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. Hi, this is Keith Williams. Welcome to 5-Watt World. We're interested in helping you get the most music from the least gear. There are moments when things change. According to vintage instrument dealer George Gruen, that moment for Burst was when the Brock Burst guitar was sold. He said I should call Vic DaPra. So I called DaPra, author of the Burst Believers series of books and a noted early collector of Bursts. Vic said, yes, that was the moment. It was 1983, but I didn't sell it then. I bought it then. He said he'd paid $13,500. He added that it was and is an amazing guitar and not beyond what it was worth, even then. Since reading Bob Willcutt's The Musical Instrument Collector, I've been mulling over why we're drawn to collecting instruments. It left me thinking about the instruments that are the most collectible. Bob's book is a treatise on why we collect instruments and why some instruments are so much more valued than others in the minds of collectors and players. Blackguard Telecasters, Gibson L5s, and of course, the Burst Les Pauls. No guitars fetch higher prices, are associated with bigger names, or elicit more debate than the mythical Bursts. Built for just 3 years from 1958 to 1960, they are now among the most highly prized guitars in the world. And since most of us will never get to play a Burst or even be in the room with one, I've partnered with Carter Vintage Guitars to use snippets of recordings of Burst that have come through their shop in the last few years. So if you've always wanted to know the details that make these guitars special and which artists use them to cast such a long shadow over the history of music so that they are so valuable today, then stay tuned, because this is the 5-Watt World short history of the Burst Les Pauls. If you enjoy our videos, take a minute to subscribe and hit the bell icon to be notified when we put out new videos. And if you've already subscribed, swing by the store to grab a t-shirt or a hoodie to support what we're doing here. And if you don't need another hoodie, but want to become a bigger part of 5-Watt World, think about becoming a friend of 5-Watt. And in response to requests, I've added a tip jar as well. The links are in the description. The stories around the creation of the Les Paul are outlined in my video, The Les Paul, A Short History. Full of the debates about who designed what and whose idea the guitar was in the first place, it's a good story. What isn't up for debate is that after a sales peak of 2,245 gold tops sold in 1953, sales of Les Pauls fell each year up to 1957. Even the introduction of the humbucking pickups, the much-lauded PAFs, and the Tune-o-matic bridge in 1957 didn't revive them. Only 557 gold tops were built, a tiny percentage of the 30,000 guitars sold by Gibson that year. Ted McCarty and company decided that the solution was to look back to their earlier design success, to a look that they'd had before, lose the opaque gold top, and add a cherry sunburst finish to the carved maple. It was a wholesale change designed to get the market's attention. Besides the finish, the specs of a 58 Les Paul are almost identical to the gold tops of the previous year, and for this reason, it isn't uncommon to see a 57 gold top refinished with a burst top. Famously, George Harrison's Cherry Red Les Paul, nicknamed Lucy, is a refinished 57 gold top. It was on this guitar that Clapton would play the solo for While My Guitar Gently Weeps. But since the maple tops in 57 were covered with the opaque gold, they were often 2, 3, or 4 pieces, and the seams of the 2-piece tops were often not in the center. You can see this clearly in the refinished Burst that Joey Landreth is playing here. At the Summer NAMM show in July of 1958, Gibson launched the cosmetic revamp of their Les Paul, a last-ditch effort to increase sales of the struggling model. Prior to that July, Les Pauls sold in 58 were still shipped with gold paint, and it was only in the second half of 58 that the move over to the center seam and new burst finish was completed. The 58 Les Paul resembled their 57 predecessor in most every way but those cosmetic differences. Gibson touted the finish in its own magazine, the Gibson Gazette, saying, "A beautiful cherry sunburst finish is the news here. The guitar now has a rich, rubbed appearance that cannot be equaled at any price, and the new look that is tops with today's guitarists. In the future, all Les Paul guitars will be shipped in cherry sunburst finish. There will be no increase in price. Gibson sprayed a nitrocellulose lacquer on the guitars in a rather involved process. The resulting finish is thin and hard and tends to achieve a particular patina along with checking as the finish ages. But of course, the most interesting thing about this finish is how the red and yellow color that was used in the sunburst changes over time. Due to varying exposure to light, sweat, and smoke, the finish on some guitars faded away altogether, leaving us with a subtle lemon drop or lemon burst. Faded in the center while remaining stronger around the edges for the iced tea burst, or even on occasion darkened where it had been applied a little thicker at the edge to give us the classic tobacco burst. The guitars with the darker finishes were often done to cover on imperfections in the top wood near the edges. You can often see the original color of a burst top under the pickup selector ring where the top has been protected from the elements. Though all of these faded finishes have since been named and then recreated by Gibson in later years, on the original burst, they all started out, with subtle variations, as cherry bursts. In 1960, Gibson would change the red dye that they were using, and for that reason, the cherry bursts on the later 1960 guitars didn't fade as the earlier ones had. The brighter red is often referred to as tangerine red or tomato soup red. Both George Grun and Vic DaPra told me that the idea that Gibson gave more consideration to this new top wood just doesn't hold water. The fact is that it was a guitar in the middle of their line at best, and they seemed to use whatever was on the top of the pile after the really high-end jazz guitars had snagged the best wood. For these reasons, special grain is very valued among collectors. Flame, Quilt, Tiger Stripe, and Blister terms that collectors use to describe the specifics of the top. Among burst collectors, the expression top and tone are the two factors that most dictate prices on the guitars. In '58, Fender had released their own three-color sunburst, and it isn't a stretch to assume that the maple tops with the bright cherry bursts were further examples of Gibson trying to stay ahead of Fender in the eyes of the marketplace. The mahogany back and neck were sprayed with cherry red finish, including a red grain filler before finishing. This filler becomes much more apparent when the back fades, as they tend to do over time. The necks on the '58 were pretty much like those of the '57. They were typically a deep D shape. Across the burst years, we'll note a slimming of the neck shape, from the D to the '59s with a less shoulder, and then even thinner in the '60s neck. But remember that any neck shape discussion from the '50s are generalizations. The necks were all finished by hand, so they varied by the skill of the person working on the necks that day. The neck is mahogany, generally Honduran, with a Brazilian rosewood fingerboard. The necks were glued into the body with a long mortise and tenon joint. This joint would be shortened during 1960, and though much is made of the long tenon, some players, like Joe Bonamassa, prefer the extra bite from the shorter tenon. The frets were medium-sized in '58, and then shifted to a larger fret wire in '59 that's more desirable. The nut was nylon, and though bone nuts are the rage these days, many players prefer the sound of the original nylon nut. The bound necks had side dot markers that were made from faux tortoise-style plastic. This last bit was pointed out to me by my friend Zach Broyles of Mythos Pedals, and is one I'd never heard before, or even read about before. The crown fret markers were perloid plastic, as they were from the beginning of Les Paul production in '52. 6 closed-back Kluson Deluxe tuners were fitted to the headstock. These had tulip-shaped plastic knobs that are very prone to shrinkage over time and are often replaced. The replacements, often trying to help with tuning stability, were usually a set of the ubiquitous Grovers. The early tuners had a single ring at the base, but a second ring was added later in '60. The serial numbers were inked on the back of the headstock and covered by clear coat lacquer. The first digit, 8, 9, or 0, denotes the year of production. The truss rod adjustment nut was covered by black, white, black plastic held in place with 2 very small screws so that they don't restrict the truss rod's action. A thin laminate of holly on the headstock face was then painted black. The words Les Paul model were inked on the headstock in thin gold script, which is very prone to wear with simple polishing. The Gibson logo is in pearloid at the top. The logo was moved up the headstock at the same time as the move to the sunburst finish. The reason for this change has never really emerged, but it's concurrent with the move to the burst, and it's an easy way to recognize a refinished 57 or 58 gold top at a glance. There's an ABR-1 bridge that had arrived on the Les Paul in 57. ABR simply stood for Adjustable Bridge. It had 6 nickel-plated brass saddles and 2 plated zinc adjustment wheels. There was a separate nickel-plated aluminum tailpiece that locks onto 2 mounting studs that go deep into the face of the guitar. Aluminum was chosen for its light weight, and the part required a lot of hand filing to clean it up before it was plated. There were a very small number of bursts with factory-installed Bigsby B7 tailpieces. Even fewer of these guitars have no holes for the stop tailpiece, as they would have had to be designated as getting a Bigsby early in the production of the guitar. There were also some where the tailpiece holes were plugged at the factory near the end of production process, or when the guitar was sent back to Gibson to have the Bigsby added. There were 2 plated strap buttons. A plastic pickguard was cut from a sheet of rigid vinyl, fitted to the body with a small metal bracket and a screw next to the neck. There are 2 plastic plates on the back covering the volume and tone controls and the pickup selector switch access. The output jack was mounted on a piece of rigid vinyl as well, a plate down by the controls with 4 screws. 4 clear plastic control knobs with gold painted bases that make them look like they're gold tinted are on the front in the classic 2-volume and 2-tone configuration. And finally, there's a 3-position selector switch surrounded with a plastic ring labeled Rhythm for the neck pickup and Lead for the bridge pickup. All of these vinyl parts were prone to darkening with age. The PAF pickups were held in place by rings made of butyrate plastic, the same material as the pickup bobbins. Original rings were labeled M69 underneath. Made of very soft plastic, the rings would conform to the arch of the top when mounted. If you look closely, you'll see that the pickup ring color was lighter than that of the pickguard on the guitars, and this is intentionally replicated on modern reissues like my R9. The pickups themselves were the near-mythic PAF, or patent applied for pickups. The pickups were designed in 1955 by engineer Seth Lover. The first prototypes are still in existence and are exactly the same as the later patent drawing portrayed. The tooling was developed during 56 and the pickups were put into production in late 56 or early 57. The pickups were added to the high-end hollow body guitars and the Les Paul model. In early 58, a small sticker was added to the bottom of the pickup base plate that read, "Patent applied for," to discourage competitors from copying the design. The stickers were used until 1962, when they were replaced with a patent number sticker. Interestingly, the patent number used was not the patent for the pickup, but for a trapeze tailpiece. The assumption is that this was to further deter competitors and to disallow them from being able to look up the patent and borrowing from it for their own designs. Each of these pickups is unique due to the fact that the pickup winding machines used didn't have automatic shutoffs. The machine operator was watching a dial and had to manually turn off the winding machine as it went past the designated 5,000 turns. This could mean the variation of a few hundred turns, which could greatly affect the sound of the pickup. The pickups were not potted and are prone to be slightly microphonic. In 1959, Gibson's plastic supplier ran out of the black butyrate used to make the bobbins and had to substitute white. We first see the pickups in the 59 guitars. As was often the case in the Golden Era, parts were put together in less rigid ways than we would expect today. As a result, there were both zebra pickups with mixed bobbin colors, and as the black ones were used up, all white or double white models. This ran from 59 into 60. The black bobbins returned to production in late 60. Likely due to the variability of individual pickups, rumors spread about the differences between the all-black, zebra, and double-white pickups. By all accounts, this tickled Seth Lover, who admitted that there were differences from one pickup to the next that would influence tone, but that difference had nothing to do with the color of the bobbins. The control knobs were on pots from Central Labs, and lately folks have come to the realization that they were often a little bit higher in value than the 500K labeled. A brisk business is currently being done by companies selling pots at 525 to 535K to find some of that telly on steroids brightness found in the bursts. The early capacitors were paper and oil Sprague Black Beauty caps, nicknamed Bumblebees caps, from the colored stripes, indicating the value of .022. While we call them bumblebees because of the stripes, Sprague always referred to these caps as Black Beauties, and in 1960 began printing the values on a solid black body. The paper and oil caps have a tolerance of plus or minus 20%, and the later solid black Mylar film caps have a 10% tolerance. The solid black caps can be found in the later 1960 bursts. So how rare are bursts? How many were really built? Well, the joke is that there were 1,700 bursts made, but there's only 3,000 of them left. Of course, this is referring to the business of copying burst, which does play an important part in the burst history. There were two sets of records at Gibson, which we'd hoped to use to figure this out. The most detailed were what Gibson called the day books, a record of guitars completed each day at the factory. But sadly, the day books for this period are missing. They have up to June 30th, 1958, and we know that it was just after this that the bursts began to ship. Without the day books, we have to turn to the shipping records, which represent the aggregate number of guitars that were shipped to dealers for that year. These are not always specific enough to be helpful. For example, it might list simply Les Paul model, and that could be either early 58 gold tops or later in that year burst Les Pauls. So having said that, the annual shipping totals for Les Pauls are as follows. In 1958, 434. In 1959, 643, and in 1960, 635. If you use these numbers, you'll come up to the often quoted total of 1,712 Les Pauls produced in 58, 59, and 60. And this is technically accurate. But there were actually 3 different Les Paul model guitars that overlap in this period of time at Gibson. As I just hinted, the issues that make an accurate number hard to pin down are on each end of the production schedule. In 58, Gibson transitioned from gold top Les Pauls to the new Sunburst finish after the July NAMM show. Les Pauls built that year before the show were gold tops. The second is the transition late in 60, when the single cut Les Paul model gave way to the new SG body shape Les Paul model guitar. In guitar historian Tony Bacon's article for Reverb on this, he approaches it this way. If we assume that the burst production began in July or August of 58, we can remove 7/12 of the production from 58, leaving us with just 181 bursts for that year. From 59, we can use the entire production of 643. In 1960, it was just the very end of the year where we move away from the single cut model took place, so we'll use 11/12 of that year, or 582 guitars, for a grand total estimate of 1,406 bursts Les Pauls made during those 3 magical years. Yasuhiko Iwanade, the author of the seminal The Beauty of the Burst, summarizes it more succinctly, saying that he believes the majority of Les Paul model guitars produced in 58 were gold tops, and for this reason he estimates the number of total bursts at just around 1,200. But the rarity of the burst doesn't begin to fully explain the prices these guitars are fetching now. I spoke to Walter Carter at Carter Vintage and asked, "They're rare, but what is it that makes these guitars so valuable?" And he slowly but definitively answered, the association with famous players. And I believe we'd all readily agree it's the association with famous artists that played them that sets these incredible prices today. Whether it's a cherry red early 64 335 because Clapton played one in cream, white neck maple strats like the one Hendrix played at Woodstock, black and gold Rickenbacker 325s like those that John Lennon played, All these instruments are more sought after due to the association in our minds with these musicians, the music made on those guitars, and in the role that music played in our lives. So let's go over some of the most influential players of bursts that contribute to this phenomenon today. I've partnered with TrueFire because I've used them for over a decade, and my playing always improves when I put in the time on their lessons. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, or professional level player, TrueFire has lessons to inspire and advance your playing. As you know, I always promote spending money on lessons before new gear. I really like TrueFire, and I think if you give them a shot, you'll like them too. Get 25% off courses using the promo code 5watt25, or like I have for many years, sign up for the All Access Pass to use the entire TrueFire catalog. You can sample anything in the catalog with the All Access Pass and see where the muse takes you. I love their tagline, learn, practice, and play with TrueFire. I'd like to thank TrueFire for partnering with me and sponsoring this video. The beginning of any discussion of famous burst players starts with Eric Clapton. So much so that I've made an entire video about it. The John Mayall and the Bluesbreaker record with Eric Clapton, also known as the Beano album, changed the sense of guitar tones for many. Suffice it to say that Clapton's use of a Les Paul running through a wide-open Marshall combo put the blues world on its ear. Released in July of '66, it sent everyone in England clamoring for a burst. Famously, Clapton's burst was stolen during rehearsals with Cream later that same year and has never resurfaced. The story is so engaging that instrument historian Tony Bacon has just published an entire book about it. To be fair, Peter Green was hot on the heels of Clapton playing his own burst, a 59. He bought it used right after his first stint with the Bluesbreakers, a gig he lost when Clapton returned to town and subsequently recorded the Beano record. Green would return to Mayall's band as burst in hand and make the album Hard Road, which many consider to be the equal of the Beano record. He would go on to make history using his burst on the early Fleetwood Mac recordings. Green eventually sold his burst to his one-time guitar student Gary Moore, reportedly for whatever you can get for your SG. Moore used the guitar to great effect across his solo work and stints in Skid Row and Thin Lizzy. After Moore's death, through a somewhat circuitous route, the guitar now resides in the possession of Metallica guitarist Kirk Hammett. It's rumored that he paid $2 million for it. Hammett uses the guitar live with the band. In 1967, Mike Bloomfield paid $100 plus his 1954 P90 Gold Top Les Paul in a deal with player repairman Dan Erlewine for Dan's 1959 Standard Burst. Bloomfield was influenced by Clapton's use of a Les Paul, but George Gruen told me that of the two, he believes that Bloomfield had a greater impact on American players looking for their own bursts. Bloomfield played the 59 with the short-lived Electric Flag and on the very influential Super Session records. He tended to play his burst loud and clean, contrary to the enthusiasm for overdrive of the day. In 1974, Bloomfield had booked a week's worth of gigs at the Cave in Vancouver, but skipped out after the first night, heading home to San Francisco. He left his two guitars, including the burst, behind, and the club owner kept them to cover his losses. Also influenced by Clapton, Jeff Beck went looking for a burst and acquired his first later in '66 at Selmer's in London, a 58 with a deep sunburst finish. Beck used the burst during a very influential time in his career, first with the Yardbirds and then on the Jeff Beck Group's debut album, Truth, in 1968. The fat and singing sustain of that Les Paul can be heard on Beck's Bolero. After the guitar was damaged while on tour in the US, Beck bought a second 58 with a highly flamed top, which he used with that group until the band broke up in 1969. Dwayne Allman is known for his brief but influential career that included at least 3 important Les Pauls. A 1957 Gold Top that he traded in September of 1970 for a 59 Cherry Burst. On the Live at Fillmore East recorded in March of 1971. The tones on that record have continued to inspire generations since. In 1971, he acquired a 58 Tobacco Burst, but would tragically die in a motorcycle crash on October 29, 1971, just after the release and success of the Fillmore East record. Jimmy Page had used a 3-pickup custom early in his career, and when Joe Walsh initially offered him a 59, he responded that he, quote, already had a Les Paul, end quote. Page would later relent and buy what would become his number 1 from Walsh in 1969 for $500. He would use that number 1 from the second Led Zeppelin album onward. Page credited Clapton as turning him on to the Les Paul into a Marshall formula. Page would buy a second 59, appropriately referred to as number 2. He had the neck shaved to match his number 1 and had 4 push-pull pots that would split the humbuckers along with phase and series switches under the pickguard. Perhaps even more than Clapton, Page brought the Les Paul to the forefront of rock guitar with the runaway success of Led Zeppelin in the late 60s and early 70s. Filmed in '73, the 1976 release of the concert film The Song Remains the Same allowed a much wider audience to experience the juggernaut that was Zeppelin on tour during the '70s. The instruments used during that show are clearly outlined in Page's recent book, Jimmy Page Anthology. During his time with the band Free, Paul Kossoff would play a much-abused 59 Les Paul to great effect. Who hasn't run through a rendition of All Right Now with their garage band? Famously, Kossoff had thrown his burst into the air at a show in the early 70s in Newcastle, breaking the neck. The guitar would be repaired and regain its position with Kossoff, only to be traded later for a 3-pickup custom with John Porter, the bassist in Roxy Music. After Kossoff's death in 1976 at just 25 years old, Arthur Ram of the band Beckett bought the burst for £700. How many guitars can you recognize by name? Pearly Gates. Unquestionably, one of the most famous bursts is Billy Gibbons' 59. And it's likely that we all know the story as well. Seeking the sound of the big pickups in Marshall that Clapton was getting, Gibbons first stumbled into a 58 Flying V. That V can be seen on the cover of Fandango, and is all over the studio side of that album as well. Pearly does the rest of the lifting on Fandango, and for that reason it's a great place to compare the sound of a burst with an original Carina V. Shortly after the V was obtained, the Reverend would find his 59 burst through a friend who told him, "There's a rancher outside of town who played in a country band but has turned his attention towards wrangling cattle." Rumor has it that the guitar resides under one of the beds at his ranch house. Gibbons drove out and bought the guitar for $250. It was 1968 and ZZ Top was just getting started. Billy happened to have the money because he'd lent an old car to an aspiring actress who used it to drive to Hollywood to audition for a part. She got the part, sold the car for good money, and sent it back to Billy. They figured it was divine intervention, and so they named the guitar Pearly Gates. On the tour following the hit Hotel California album, you could have seen Joe Walsh and Don Felder each playing a burst. Joe Walsh had recently joined the band and brought the sound and attitude of his 1960 burst with him. Don Felder had his 59 burst already there, and together they made musical history. And another loud sound from my teen years, Ace Frehley from Kiss played a 59. Faded to a classic Dirty Lemon burst, Frehley used the guitar throughout his time with Kiss in both the studio and on stage. Much like All Right Now, we all played I Wanna Rock and Roll on our Hondo Les Paul copies later in our teen years than we would care to admit. Okay, well, maybe I did. In the 80s, one man was the electric guitar in the eyes of the popular music world, Steve Lukather. He was on everything, and a good portion of his work was done on a burst. Toto often had a reputation among rock fans as being a bit soft, but in recent years their esteem has grown. Luke can be seen with Les Pauls in many of the videos and live performances after the first album's tour, where he quickly demonstrates why he was asked to play 99% of the guitar parts on Thriller, the album that has now sold more copies than any other. And in the 90s, Slash's Appetite for Destruction 59 burst can't be left out. The story goes that when it came time to make the record, the band's management found a 59 for Slash to play. It later came out that it wasn't actually a Gibson. It looked like a Gibson, and it was initially reported in the press as one, but in fact the guitar was a perfect replica made by famed luthier Max Barnett. And when a second guitar was needed as a backup for the road, another guitar built by Barnett was acquired. Of course, it can be argued that Slash single-handedly brought back the popularity of the Les Paul in the 90s. Ironically, he was playing a guitar that was not built by Gibson. The icing on the cake came when it came time to do the inevitable Slash replica guitars. The custom shop found themselves copying the copy, of course. These spot-on replicas are the source of the earlier joke there were about 1,500 bursts made and there's only 3,000 left. These copies, many of which were the equal of the burst, used original woods, hand construction, and often had original 50s Gibson hardware. It takes an extremely knowledgeable collector, someone that's had access to many bursts, to know one that's not the real thing. If you watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm always chasing the stories that led to the creation and use of these instruments. Whether guitar, amp, or pedals, for me, it's the depth of the story that infuses the instruments with meaning. And reading Bob Willcutt's book, or talking with Walter Carter, George Gruen, or Vic DaPra about vintage prices, I'm more convinced than ever that it's the power of these stories that creates the value as well. Holding a Les Paul, we can imagine ourselves a young Eric Clapton, sitting in the slightly musty old Decca studio, waiting for a chance to take another stab at stepping out. As Walsh or Felder working on the exchange of solos at the end of Hotel California. Or, if your imagination runs a bit larger than mine, a 29-year-old Jimmy Page, your 59 slung low, waiting backstage in 1973 at Madison Square Garden to go on to play the shows that would be recorded and released as The Song Remains the Same. I mean to imply that the six-figure prices paid for bursts today spring solely from some sort of internal rock and roll fantasy camp. But I would argue that it's nearly impossible to disassociate those artists from those images of Les Pauls. It's the stories, both real and imagined, that imbue bursts with the power to change lives, either ours or the listener of the music that we might create. And that is what we're all willing to pay for. If I missed your favorite part of the story of the burst, please put it in the comments for everyone to enjoy. I know I can count on you. First, I need to thank John Ronquillo and Walter Carter of Carter Vintage Guitars for permission to use video snippets and images of the 10 or so bursts that have passed through their doors in the last few years. There aren't many shops that are at the center of the vintage world, but in a short time, Carter has certainly become one of them. I'm thankful for their collaboration on this video. It would have been thinner and quieter without them. I need to thank my partner in crime, Jeff McErlain. I don't know anyone that can do a better impression of a youthful Eric Clapton than Jeff can. And yes, his historic makeover R9 and his 71 Marshall Super Lead help. But gear is never a substitute for having done the study and put in the hours, and Jeff has done both. For that reason, I'm always thrilled when he can spend some time with us in 5-Watt World. I need to thank my script editor, Perry McManus. Between my wife Ann, Perry, and Jeff, I recently made the leap and bought a November 2020 custom shop R9. I think that Perry is just a little too pleased with himself about that. And who can blame him? It's a great guitar, and it teaches me things each time I play it. I need to thank Bob Willcutt of Willcutt Guitars, both for his book, The Musical Instrument Collector, which was one of my 5 favorite books of 2020, and for taking the time to speak with me about multiple occasions about why we collect and why we don't. I need to thank George Gruen for taking the time out to speak with me about his sense of when the burst prices began to soar. And I need to thank Vic DaPra for so comfortably copying to his role in that story, and for sharing much more about who made the difference in the sales of Les Pauls over the years. There were 4 primary texts that I used: The Beauty of the Burst by Yasuhiko Iwanade, Sunburst by Tony Bacon, The Gibson Les Paul by Dave Hunter, and Vic DaPra's Sunburst Alley. Most of the details in this video can be traced back to these excellent books, and they're linked in the description. I need to thank all of you that stopped by the store to grab a t-shirt, hat, or the Stomp preset pack. Your support keeps 5-Watt World going. And as always, I need to thank the guys and friends of 5-Watt, an ever-growing guitar community of supporters of 5-Watt World. I really appreciate having you guys on board for the ride. If you enjoyed this short history of the Burst Les Pauls, hit the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that too. Thanks for watching. Until next time, thanks for being a part of the 5-Watt World.